Machery, Director of the Center for Philosophy of Science, and I would like to welcome you to a new episode of Conversations at the Center, the podcast of the Center for Philosophy of Science. Today we will have a new episode with a distinct flavor. I have with me today 3 undergraduates who took part to our summer program, the Pittsburgh Summer Program in Philosophy of Science, which we organize every year, when we bring 15 undergraduates to do philosophy of science, to have 2 seminars in philosophy of science, one in the morning, one in the evening, for a whole week. And this program just concluded about 1 hour ago. So could you introduce yourself, please? Maddox, why don't you start?
Yes, thank you so much, Edouard. My name is Maddox Larson. I'm studying philosophy with minors in economics and math at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska.
So what are your main interests in philosophy of science?
My main interests are philosophy of economics, especially causation and modeling, and philosophy of mathematics.
Good. And I believe you also have interest in epistemology. Is that
Yes,
right?
epistemology
Good.
is a big area of interest for me.
Very good. Arina, do you want to be next?
Yep. Thank you. I'm Arina. I go to New York University and I study philosophy of physics and metaphysics. And I also have a separate interest in philosophy of language and the study of consciousness.
Many thanks. Jacinta, do you want to introduce yourself?
Of course. My name is Jacinta. I'm originally from Mexico City. I come from Bard College in upstate New York. And I just graduated from a degree in both physics and in philosophy. And my main interests are, well, philosophy of physics, but philosophy of astrophysics, philosophy of astrobiology, all of that.
Thanks. That's wonderful. So I have to say it's been a real pleasure to have you for the whole week, you and the 12 other undergraduates. It's always a pleasure to have undergraduates during the summer here at Pitt, but this year has been particularly exciting. So maybe to get us started, did you enjoy the summer program? Maddox, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, it was so much fun to be able to spend a week kind of with peers who also have similar interests, but also who have differing interests, and kind of be able to hash out some issues. We, even when we weren't in seminars, we still talked about philosophy, we still argued. It was just a lot of fun because these are other really smart, intelligent people. And of course, the seminars were just so much fun. The discussions were so interesting and lively. So it was, yes, I definitely enjoyed it.
What about Jacinta?
Yeah, for me, definitely. Like the moment I heard that there was a summer program just in philosophy of science, I knew I had to go there. I've been in other philosophy summer programs, but I think what I appreciated from this one was that it was just philosophy of science. And not only like my interest, like philosophy of physics, it really gave us a well-rounded experience of other sciences and philosophy.
Thanks. Now, what was your experience?
I also thought that the social aspect of our program was amazing because even at a larger school, I think in your grade, perhaps you would have 1 or 2 other students at most with your same interest, especially when it's something more niche like philosophy of physics. But here I had like 4 or 5 peers doing the same kind of work I'm doing, but from such different approaches. And of course, getting into contact with people who do bioethics or philosophy of neuroscience and a lot of things I haven't really gotten into contact with as much was immensely helpful in building new perspectives.
I mean, I should say that the social aspect is largely due to you. It is because you are curious minds willing to talk to other people that the program works. It unfortunately, it does not depend really on us, the organizer. But I'm delighted you were able to do philosophy because philosophy is very much the kind of things we do when we talk to one another. So maybe moving slightly away from PSP, we'll come back to PSP maybe at the end of this recording. What attracted you to philosophy? Why philosophy in general, in contrast maybe to some other humanities? Could be history, could be some aspects of literature, drama, what have you, or maybe some sciences. So why philosophy? Arina, do you want to start?
Yeah, actually, initially when I was younger, I thought I would just do physics or quantum mechanics or something like that. But a lot of the times when I was studying science, I feel kind of satisfied with a lot of explanation we were given because a lot of it felt like a shallow explanation that doesn't get to the deeper level of what's pushes behind the phenomena. And I think a lot of why I'm interested in metaphysics is to dip deeper than sort of more descriptive or other kind of scientific theory and look sort of like further than that.
Jacinta?
Yes, I feel actually very similarly. I noticed like in high school and even beginning of my career at physics at Bard that I didn't get the most out of the classes just by the content of the mathematics of it. So it was this like deeper meaning of the questions that the sciences and even the humanities, like this also happened to me while taking some humanities classes, that it was like deeper questions that made me want to know more.
Maddox, do you have any specific experience about why philosophy did matter for you?
Yeah, I think for me it was maybe less often the content, but more so just kind of the approach of the philosopher. The physicist, he has math in his back pocket. Social scientists use statistics a lot. But there's something different that the philosopher is doing. He is asking these complicated questions about, the metaphysics of physical theories. But there's a lot more introspection. And then we kind of take that introspection and we kind of hone that through argumentation to make it clear and concise. And for me, that's kind of at the heart of philosophy, and that's really what drew me in, mostly because I read Descartes, and I had no clue what was going on. I thought there has to be a better way.
Yeah, so myself was attracted to philosophy in large part because of the rigor. I did find quite interesting that one can be very rigorous, but not using mathematics or formal language, but using a natural language. That there's a way to use the words we use on an everyday basis, but to make them rigorous. And when I discovered philosophy, for me it was a revelation that you don't need to do mathematics to be rigorous. That was personally what did attract me to philosophy. But what about philosophy of science? What interests you most, or maybe why did you get some interest in philosophy of economics or philosophy of physics? Why those sciences have captured your interest? Do you have any thought? Jacinta, do you want to start?
Yes, definitely. I think philosophy of science for me was the exact middle point between what I was doing in my physics classes and my philosophy classes. So as I mentioned before, I felt like none of them really satisfied my particular interest. But when I took my first philosophy of science class, it was called philosophy of experiment. I said, like, this is particularly it. Additionally, because it also had a historical emphasis to it. And the skills, like Maddox mentioned, that the philosopher has in their toolbox, applied to the sciences, really opens up a whole other perspective than the scientist.
Yeah. Arina, do you?
Yeah, aside from, of course, what I said, I'm really interested in the nature of space, time, and matter. I also find the social aspect of how scientists carry out their work very intriguing because oftentimes we have this value-laden kind of idea that scientists are uber rational and they are objective, but that is really kind of, in a sense, a misunderstanding of the nature of scientists as social animals that can be observed sort of experimentally almost as our subject. And how do we assess their risk of induction? What kind of induction they're making are reasonable or safe? What kind of induction they're making we should worry about and perhaps think of it methodologically more is very fascinating to me as well.
Maddox?
I think for me, it was kind of through my interest in epistemology. So in theories of knowledge, there's this question of how much certainty can we get, and whether or not certainty is relevant to kind of what we're doing at all when we're trying to learn about the world. And so kind of through my search through certainty, I was kind of exposed to, well, science seems to be this really certain thing, right? I mean, surely it is. And so is math, of course. These are profound truths about the universe. And I kind of got into it more, and turns out it's a bit more complicated. And then I was taking economics courses where we oftentimes treat certain things as very certain. We know laws of supply, we know laws of demand, and the only thing that we don't know is the particular outcomes that we would suggest. So for me, philosophy of science and philosophy of economics in particular kind of allows this kind of outlet to kind of hone these particular interests in certainty, but also in actionable outcomes, kind of into one pursuit. So I've really appreciated that.
And do you have any favorite topics in philosophy of science? Could be, either a topic in a specific area. You mentioned space and time, which of course belongs to the philosophy of physics to a large extent, or could be more general topics in the general philosophy of science, laws, causation, induction. As far as I'm concerned, confirmation is one of my main interests, just like some of my colleagues here, like John Norton, for example, at Pitt. Confirmation is one of my main interests in the general philosophy of science. So what about you? Maddox, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm really interested in kind of scientific theories and models, and then explanation as well. So like, how do theories represent phenomena, and how are those models relevant to the process of explaining those phenomena as well?
Yeah, so I do actually want to touch to this point exactly of this is more relevant to what I did my thesis on, which was like what we actually had a class in this week about, which is the values of science. So science in society. And I think that particularly is like extremely interesting to me. And what I did was like its application to astrobiology, but really in every science. Like the values are very, very interesting for me to consider, apart epistemology and other things.
Arina?
Yeah, so recently I've been very interested in the nature of orientation in space. I worked a lot about with like CPT symmetry and incongruent counterparts. So I'm really trying to get at, is there a fundamental preference for orientation in space? If not, how do we reconcile the issue of relationalism and absolutism? And I think there's still a lot more to be explored about that. And working with like a thought experiment like the Ozma problem, where we have identical universe potentially with different preference in orientation. And I think that's some fascinating work that can reveal some nature of space-time.
Wonderful. Does any of you already have original weird views in philosophy of science that you've developed over the years that somehow you've gravitated to?
Yeah, I can
go for it, Maddox.
I can start. I am extremely skeptical of induction, like probably beyond a safe level, to be honest, sometimes, because I was taking an abstract math class, and so we were like proving things via the method of induction, which often meant we'll assume a hypothesis, and then we can show that either the next relevant case follows from that, or we can show that the next n number of relevant cases follow from that, and that's how we do a lot of mathematical proofs. And to me, that seems like a really strange move. It seems like we're already like assuming part of what we're trying to show. So this also builds on, I guess, kind of the topic of like what counts as evidence in science, because I'm really skeptical of whether or not we can say like these kind of inductive methods are proof of anything. They seem more like demonstrations. Like they feel a lot more hand wavy than we often treat them as. So I'm really skeptical of induction and proof.
Good. This is a radical view indeed.
Yes.
But I call for it. So any Arina or Jacinta, do you have any views that you think are that you really are committed to and are unusual in philosophy of science?
I don't know how unusual this is, but I have this epistemic intuition that I know that the intuition is a word that's very ambiguous here, but I really think that there's a lot of issues to reduction, and there's kind of a need for holistic view of how do we approach what is truth inducive and what is not. And I think a lot of reduction does make the nuances go away in a very critical way that is an epistemic harm.
Yeah, and I think for me it's just related to like thought experiments versus like real experiments. So like the part of what do you need to do physically in order to prove. So this idea of proof and like uncertainty, something.
Good. Thank you very much. So one issue for philosophers of science that professional philosophers of science have to address on a regular basis is what is philosophically relevant in science? So how do we find the parts of science that are the most philosophically relevant? And there are many ways to do that. Some of us look at traditional issues in philosophy of science, so it's not like we're looking at the sciences to find philosophical issues. There's decades of thinking about laws of nature, and so we write about laws of nature. Same is true of explanation. Another methodology comes from more looking at specific sciences and finding there some topics of philosophical interest. How do you do it? Do you have or what would be your preferred way of doing philosophy of science, of finding out what's philosophically relevant in the sciences?
Yeah,
go for it.
I want to jump straight in because the first thing that comes to my mind is, again, this idea of like the values of science. And I think this aligns a lot to the class that we had, but also just to general history in this area. And Heather Douglas mentions there are different values, the value-free ideal, epistemic versus non-epistemic, but even beyond, like to figure out what philosophically matters in science, we can turn to values as like, what are the cognitive values that matter? What are the social or ethical values?
Yeah, I think for me, the first place I kind of always start is just the procedure of science. Like, what are we doing? What is the day-to-day life, of an experimental physicist or an astrobiologist kind of look like? And for me, I find that kind of at every step along the way, there's always some interesting questions to ask. And I guess, like, specifically for my interest in kind of philosophy of economics, there's a wealth of criticisms about the scientific status of economics, what we're doing when we're using mathematical models or, behavioral assumptions. And so part of my interest is kind of taking some of these kind of like more, in some sense, robust sciences that we often think of as very scientific, like physics and chemistry, and kind of seeing what's going on there, and seeing what we can do with social science to make it more scientific, to see, what is the biologist doing on a day-to-day basis, and is that something that the economist needs to be doing? I think asking that question in particular has become more popular through different things, like, the feminist critique of values in science, like Jacinta was saying, but also some kind of just more broader questions, I think, in philosophy of science.
Yeah, so you mentioned economics, and we've talked quite a bit about physics already. I think it's interesting that some disciplines seems to be maybe more conducive to philosophical thinking than others. I think all disciplines are conducive, but some of them have, maybe because there are more issues or open issues, or maybe it's because they touch upon more traditional philosophical questions. That's obviously the case of physics. I think economics has a lot of issues about methods, about what is really doing, and all that really call for a lot of philosophical thinking. There's less, and maybe it's an accident, but maybe it's not. There's less philosophy of chemistry, for example. I mean, there's some interesting questions of philosophy of chemistry, particularly how it relates to physics, and so there are interesting open questions, but it does not seem to be as rich, at least as far as I know. Maybe it's an accident, but maybe there's a bit more to be said about that. So, Arina, how do you do philosophy of science?
So I kind of always think to look at when I see conceptual ambiguity, that no matter how much literature I read, that doesn't go away, that persists. For example, the idea of measurement is incredibly ambiguous, and till this day, scientists do not agree on what measurement really entails and what is the qualification for measurement. And I think that is a nice segue for philosophers to partake in kind of look at these ambiguity and try to find clarification and find a way to make it more presentable instead of a very blurry concept that we kind of just practically use but never examine.
Yeah, I think you're right. Conceptual confusions or ambiguities are common in science, as they are common everywhere in any language. And often they have a philosophical nature. And of course, we are really quite good as philosophers to spot them and try to think about them, try to draw distinctions in a way that sometimes can be quite helpful for scientists too. Speaking of which, do you think philosophers of science are useful for scientists, or are we more like the ornithologue studying the birds, but not of great help for the birds? What do you think?
Well, I would hope so. I would hope so. And I think a lot of the professors during this week mentioned this collaboration with scientists. And they said some scientists are more willing to work with us than others, but the things that they would talk about, what they would do with scientists, would be extremely rich. So I do think and I even mentioned this in my thesis, I do think we should collaborate more and turn to scientists, and they should begin to turn to us, I think.
I think for me, kind of like Jacinta was saying, I think all of the talks this week that we've attended have been really informative, but I thought especially Wayne Wu's from Carnegie Mellon, his work is particularly interesting to me because essentially what Wayne presented to us was the way his project kind of on attention and consciousness developed was he kind of had this really philosophical problem with the way that we talk about attention. And so he looked at the philosophy, he looked at the science, and he realized that no one had satisfying answers, and so he built out some of the philosophy, and then he took it to scientists, and he took it to the empirical kind of grounding of neuroscience and cognitive science to see what he could build on that. And so to me, I think that alone shows that, yes, I think philosophers of science definitely have something to add to the table, and that it's such a rich thing that they can add a perspective that scientists are kind of blind to. But again, that's not just Wayne's work. I mean, we heard from lots of different people about all kinds of work that they're doing that applies. So I hope that what we're doing is helpful, and I'm very optimistic that it is helpful.
Arina, do you have any thoughts on the matter?
I think, again, using physics as an example, there are some things that really philosopher can help us make decisions that somehow scientists may not help inform us, because a lot of mathematical models don't have direct physical evidence that would suggest one is better than another. But we as philosophers can help people decide, hey, is the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, or is it quantum field theory, quantum information theory? How do we decide which theory share more virtues, in a sense? And what we find is when scientists actually conduct their researches, they use these theories interchangeably without thinking much of the ramification of the reason behind that. And I think there's so much space for us to explore in that sense.
I mean, I should say, so I agree with you. I mean, with many of my colleagues here at Pitt, I hope that my work is of interest and sometimes of relevance to scientists themselves. On the other hand, it wouldn't be such a disaster if philosophy of science was, in a way, about science without necessarily interacting with what scientists are doing. I think there's room here for philosophy of science to be understanding what scientists are doing without necessarily meddling with the process of science. In fact, I think there are different styles of philosophy of science. Some of those styles are much more interacting with the process of science. Some are much more like an outsider looking at the object of science and not necessarily meddling with its dynamics. So maybe coming back to you and to conclude to PSP, do you guys want to go to grad school in philosophy? And do you think you would like to become a professional philosopher? Jacinta, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I guess after this experience, I am really considering philosophy specifically in philosophy of science. And I think it has just spurred a lot of new interest that I didn't have. And I think that's a pattern I felt in my career with philosophy. The more I learn, the more I want to learn more. And the more I realize I know less, so I want to learn more. So I think I'm for sure considering some form of grad school, either a master's or a PhD, definitely.
Thank you. Arina?
I'm also, at least as far as I know, I see grad school in my future, but along the way, I think I also am planning on seeking opportunity to work for a federal correctional institution for a couple years, if it's possible, perhaps after my grad school education. But I really have the sense that philosophical thinking can be really helpful for people in certain circumstances and almost can serve as alternative way of guiding people in difficult situations to different kinds of realization that doesn't necessarily rely on religion and certain ideologies.
Good.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm kind of approaching my senior year, so I'm planning on applying during this next application cycle. And like Jacinta said, this week has kind of just encouraged me even more. If I wasn't excited about it before, I most certainly am now. And yeah, maybe just recapitulating what Jacinta said, I'm definitely more intent, I think, on my plan to kind of pursue philosophy of science, especially.
Good, wonderful. I'm delighted to hear that. And maybe to conclude this episode today, would you recommend the Pittsburgh Summer Program to other undergraduates? Maddox?
I mean, the short answer is yes.
Oh, I love that kind of short answer, Jacinta.
Yeah, I would say no question, and in fact, I am thinking of emailing my professors back at my college to send word.
My answer is absolutely, and I think a lot of people don't realize Pittsburgh also has an amazingly beautiful campus. If you've never been to Pittsburgh, and this program so far has helped me a lot with also orienting myself in the graduate school application process too, because a lot of us don't have the resources to learn about this, and this has been incredibly helpful for me in thinking about how to help me with like my upcoming cycle application as well.
All right, wonderful. I'm delighted to hear that. Thanks for coming this week, and thanks for taking the time to record this podcast. And I would like to thank all of you for listening to our podcast today. Thank you very much. Have a good day.